Hey guys, tonight we take a step back in time, way back, all the way to ancient Rome. Picture the sun-drenched streets, the hustle and bustle of daily life in one of the most powerful civilizations in history. The scent of fresh bread fills the air, mingling with the noise of merchants calling out their wares, and the distant hum of the Roman legions marching in formation. But let's be honest here. While Rome was known for its impressive architecture and philosophical advancements, it had a dark side when it came to punishment. You probably wouldn't survive this without a serious dose of strength, or a good sense of humor to get through it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and the time. It'll make this whole bedtime experience feel like we're all experiencing it together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ancient Roman punishments were, well, a bit more imaginative and brutal than what we're used to today. If you've ever thought your modern punishment was too harsh, just wait until you hear how the Romans did it. The justice system in ancient Rome was all about making an example of people, public humiliation, and some seriously twisted ways of meting out punishment. So, let's dive into the bizarre world of Roman retribution and explore some of the weirdest, most horrifying punishments they had to offer. Forget about a slap on the wrist or even a lengthy prison sentence. If you messed up in ancient Rome, the consequences were often swift, dramatic, and downright terrifying. From gladiatorial combat serving as a punishment to erasing people from history, the Romans had a few creative ideas about how to deal with their criminals. Let's start with the spectacle of Roman justice. Bread and circuses. You've probably heard the phrase, but did you know it wasn't just about feeding the people in ancient Rome? The term also referred to how the ruling elite kept the masses entertained, often through brutal public punishments disguised as entertainment. Gladiatorial combat, for example, wasn't just a way to entertain the crowd. It was also a punishment for criminals, prisoners of war, and those condemned by the state. You might find yourself shackled in the arena, forced to fight for your life in front of thousands, your fate decided by the whims of the crowd or the emperor himself. Imagine the scene, the roar of the crowd, the thudding of weapons against shields, the sharp smell of sweat and blood in the air, and the sand beneath your feet stained with the aftermath of battle. For the condemned, this wasn't just entertainment. It was a public execution dressed up as sport. And it wasn't reserved for just the worst criminals. If you were unlucky enough to fall out of favor with the wrong person, you could find yourself thrown into the arena with little more than a sword and your survival instincts. Sometimes, gladiators were criminals forced to fight for their freedom. Other times, they were captives made to fight for the amusement of the masses. And while the idea of fighting for freedom might sound thrilling in theory, the reality was a gruesome death sentence for many. Historians still debate the exact nature of gladiatorial combat's connection to punishment. Some suggest it was more a tool of social control, keeping the masses distracted and entertained while reminding them of the harsh reality that could befall anyone who stepped out of line. Others argue it was a genuinely popular form of entertainment, and punishment was merely an incidental aspect of the games. Either way, the fact remains that gladiatorial combat was, for many, a brutal and deadly form of Roman justice. The gladiator games weren't just a form of entertainment. They were a grim reminder that if you crossed the wrong person or angered the wrong authority, Your fate could end in the blood-soaked sand of the arena. And if you survived, well, you might get to walk away with a little glory. But don't get too comfortable, because the next fight could be your last. Let's shift gears now to something a little more subtle, but equally sinister. Damnatio memoriae, or the condemnation of memory. Imagine this. You've spent your life serving the empire, only to fall out of favor with the wrong emperor or the wrong powerful figure. You're not executed, but your legacy completely erased. This punishment was reserved for those who had committed egregious offenses, such as high treason or betrayal. The Romans had a peculiar way of punishing their enemies and traitors, by ensuring they were forgotten by future generations. The punishment was a form of public erasure, a fate far worse than death for many of the Romans. You could be officially declared an enemy of the state, and your name would be struck from all public records, monuments, and inscriptions. Statues of you could be defaced or destroyed. Coins bearing your image would be melted down, and your accomplishments would be rewritten as though they never happened. Your very existence would be wiped from history. Imagine living in a time where your reputation and your family's name were everything, where your legacy was tied to the public's perception of you. Now imagine that. One day, you wake up and realize that the empire has erased you from the records. Your statues are no longer standing in the forums. Your name is no longer whispered in reverence. You've become a ghost, an official non-person to the Romans. There was no worse punishment than to be stripped of your identity and erased from the public consciousness. Historians still argue whether damnatio memoriae was a symbolic act of vengeance or whether it truly worked as a punishment. Some believe that being erased from memory was a way to show others the consequences of betraying the empire. If you couldn't even be remembered, what good was your life? Others argue that it was a more practical form of punishment, one that kept the social order intact by preventing any lingering symbols of the fallen traitor from inspiring rebellion or dissent. Regardless of its intention, damnatio memoriae was a reminder that in Rome, it wasn't just about the physical death, it was about dying in the eyes of your people, never to be remembered again. A quirky little detail about this punishment is that damnatio memoriae wasn't always permanent. Sometimes, if the disgraced person's actions were later deemed to be not as treasonous as originally thought, they could be rehabilitated in a sense. Their memory could be restored, their statues repaired, and their name added back into the records. It was like being brought back to life, though you could never quite shake the shadow of your past. Let's move on to something a bit more hands-on when it comes to punishment. Fustuarium. Imagine you're a Roman soldier, and you've done something incredibly wrong. Perhaps you fled from the battlefield, disobeyed a direct order, or shown a blatant disregard for the authority of your commanders. You've broken the sacred bond of discipline in the Roman legions. And the penalty, it's not just a slap on the wrist. No, it's an unforgiving, brutal form of corporal punishment known as the fustuarium, which involved being brutally flogged with a heavy wooden stick. The punishment was harsh and designed to strike terror into the hearts of the soldiers. A wooden stick, sometimes as large as a club, would be used to beat the guilty soldier. It was a punishment that could easily be fatal, depending on the severity of the beating and the condition of the soldier. But there was no escape for the guilty party. This was not just a physical punishment. It was a reminder to every soldier that the discipline of the Roman legions was paramount. In a military society where honor and obedience were everything, failing in the field of battle could cost you not just your career, but your life. Historians still argue about the frequency of fustuarium as a punishment, while some believe it was used frequently to maintain order in the legions. Others argue it may have been used sparingly, as such extreme measures were meant to make an example out of only the most severe offenders. One thing is certain, though, if you were on the receiving end of the fustuarium, it was a clear message from your superiors. You were expendable if you couldn't maintain the discipline required to serve Rome. The use of violence to maintain order in the legions was part of a larger Roman military culture that valued unwavering loyalty and duty. If you failed in that duty, your life might not be worth much. But the punishment wasn't just for those who directly betrayed the military. It could also be used as a form of punishment for soldiers who had let down their comrades in any way, whether by failing in their duties or by cowardice. The point was to eliminate weakness within the ranks, and fustuarium made sure that no soldier would forget what happened to those who betrayed Rome's strict code. A quirky tidbit here. The fustuarium wasn't always carried out publicly, but when it was, it became a spectacle. Soldiers who were publicly flogged were often made an example of to prevent others from making the same mistake. Imagine being forced to watch a fellow soldier get beaten into submission, knowing that you were next if you didn't uphold the standards of the Roman military. It wasn't just about pain. It was about public humiliation and making sure every Roman soldier knew exactly what would happen if they broke the ranks. Now, let's talk about one of the most gruesome and infamous punishments in ancient Rome: crucifixion. When we think of crucifixion today, we often think of the story of Jesus Christ. But this practice was used long before the Christian era. Crucifixion wasn't just a form of punishment. It was a public display meant to instill fear, terror, and humiliation. It was considered the ultimate form of execution and was reserved for the most heinous criminals, those who were seen as a direct threat to the Roman state or its social order. Picture this. You've been convicted of the worst crimes in the eyes of Rome: rebellion, high treason, or perhaps even murder. And the sentence is death by crucifixion. You are bound to a wooden cross, nailed through the wrists and feet, and hoisted into place, left to die in full view of the public. Crucifixion wasn't just about dying. It was about making an example of the condemned. It was a long, slow death, typically caused by a combination of blood loss, shock, and asphyxiation. The person would often hang there for hours, even days, enduring excruciating pain as they slowly suffocated under their own weight. It was designed to be a slow and agonizing death, a punishment that could last for hours or even days. The victim would often be publicly humiliated, stripped naked, and left to die in a public space, so that everyone could witness the consequences of defying the Roman state. Crucifixion wasn't just about killing a criminal. It was about sending a message to the masses. It was a visual and psychological tool, one that kept the citizens of Rome in check, reminding them of the consequences of defying the emperor, the state, or the law. Historians still argue about the prevalence of crucifixion in Roman society. Some suggest it was primarily reserved for slaves and non-citizens, people who didn't have the protections of Roman law. But others claim it was occasionally used for citizens who had committed the most severe crimes. Regardless of the specific cases, it was reserved for the worst of the worst. The brutal nature of crucifixion ensured that the criminal would be remembered not for their crimes, but for the horrific spectacle of their death. Crucifixion, unlike some of the other forms of execution, left a lasting image that lingered in the minds of Romans long after the victim was gone. A quirky detail here. Sometimes, crucifixion victims were not left to die alone. In some cases, the Roman authorities would crucify a group of criminals, turning the whole event into a grisly public spectacle. These public executions could be part of a wider show of force, meant to remind the people of Rome that the power of the state was absolute. In fact, in certain cases, it was not uncommon for people to watch these executions as a form of entertainment, like spectators at a gladiatorial fight, but with far more grim consequences. The ultimate aim of crucifixion, however, was to publicly demonstrate the power of the Roman Empire, not just in terms of physical might, but in terms of the absolute control the state had over life and death. If you defied Rome, you would not just be killed, you would be destroyed in the most public and degrading way imaginable. And the legacy of crucifixion, at least as a form of punishment, would leave a lasting scar on history, forever associated with the oppressive might of ancient Rome. Let's move on to something even more bizarre and unexpected. Poena Culae, or the punishment of the sack. Now, this might sound like something straight out of a bad horror movie, but it was a real punishment in ancient Rome. Imagine being convicted of a serious crime, like parricide, the killing of a parent, and the punishment is something truly horrifying. Being sewn into a sack with live animals and then thrown into the water to drown. Yes, you heard that right. The Romans had a way of making sure you paid for your crimes with a little extra terror. This punishment was meant to be symbolic, reflecting the unnaturalness of killing one's own parent, but the method of carrying it out completely over the top. The condemned person was placed in a large sack, along with a collection of live animals, typically a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey. The poor criminal would be sewn into the sack with these creatures, all of which would struggle and thrash around as they were thrown into a river or lake to drown. Not only was this punishment brutal, but it also added a layer of chaos and horror to the whole process. The struggling animals and the fear of drowning created a nightmarish situation for anyone unlucky enough to face Poena Culae. Historians still argue about the exact origins of Poena Culae. Some believe it was a Roman invention, specifically created to punish those who committed the ultimate crime against their family. Others suggest it was borrowed from earlier, pre-Roman traditions, where criminals were similarly punished in horrifying ways. Regardless of where it came from, the fact remains that Poena Culae was a terrifying punishment that emphasized just how seriously the Romans took family loyalty. Killing a parent wasn't just a crime, it was a violation of the very foundation of Roman society. And the penalty was designed to make you pay not only with your life, but also with the ultimate humiliation. Imagine what it must have felt like to be condemned to this punishment, knowing that your last moments would be spent in darkness and terror, struggling against the confined space of a sack, surrounded by panicked, thrashing animals. It's one of those punishments that makes you really appreciate the fact that we don't have anything like it in modern times. And yet, in the context of Roman law, it made sense. A horrific, symbolic way to show that killing your own flesh and blood was an act so unnatural, so horrifying, that only the most degrading of deaths would suffice. A quirky fact about Poena Culae: in some versions of the punishment, the condemned person wasn't even killed immediately. Sometimes, they would be left to float for a while in the sack, trapped and helpless, as the animals tore at each other and the victim, adding an element of suffering that lasted far longer than you'd expect from a mere execution. This prolonged death was intended to show that, for the Romans, A crime against family and order wasn't just about removing a person from society. It was about ensuring their punishment would live on in the memories of all who witnessed or heard of it. Now, let's delve into another curious form of punishment that might make you shiver. The trial by hot iron. In ancient Rome, justice wasn't always about evidence or due process. Sometimes, it was about letting the gods decide your fate. One way the Romans put their trust in the gods was through ordeals, including the trial by hot iron, a method designed to determine guilt or innocence through something as brutal as it sounds, physical pain. Imagine this. You're accused of a crime, but there isn't enough evidence to convict you. In a twist of fate, the decision might be left in the hands of the gods. The trial by hot iron involved the accused being forced to hold or to touch a red-hot iron, sometimes on their bare skin, or even to walk barefoot over a path of burning coals. The premise was simple. If you were innocent, the gods would protect you, and you wouldn't be burned. If you were guilty, however, the gods would let you suffer, and you would be severely injured by the iron. The pain was unbearable. Roman laws were particularly concerned with fairness, but trials like these were all about superstition and fate. Guilt wasn't determined by what you knew, but by whether the gods decided to spare you. If you survived the ordeal without injury, it was taken as a sign of divine intervention, and you were deemed innocent. But if the iron left a burn mark, that was your proof of guilt. It was a horrific form of justice, and it left the victim in the hands of fate rather than any logical judgment. Historians still debate how common the trial by hot iron was. Some argue that it was widely used, particularly in cases where evidence was lacking, or when the crime was particularly serious. Others suggest that these trials were rare, reserved for exceptional circumstances. It's hard to know exactly how often it was used, but the fact that such methods existed in the legal system speaks volumes about how Romans viewed justice, less as a rational process and more as an act of divine judgment. The trial by hot iron was not just about physical pain. It was about forcing the accused to submit to divine will. Imagine the terror you'd feel, knowing that your fate wasn't in the hands of the courts, but in the gods' hands, and whether you'd end up with burned flesh or not depended entirely on a spiritual lottery. And yet, despite the obvious flaws in this approach, the Romans believed it was a legitimate way to prove a person's innocence or guilt, often coupled with other forms of divination or superstition. One of the more quirky details of this punishment is that it wasn't always just about burning. In some cases, the accused would be forced to undergo multiple trials in one go, having to hold the hot iron and then drink a potion or endure another painful ordeal to test their endurance. In some bizarre versions of the punishment, the iron was heated in a public display, adding an extra layer of public spectacle to the justice process. It wasn't just about punishing someone, it was about creating a vivid, unforgettable experience that left a mark on both the victim and the witnesses. To think that something as violent as this was once a widely accepted form of legal procedure is almost unfathomable today. We've come a long way from letting the gods decide. But in Rome, there was a time when a burning hot iron was just as valid a way to determine guilt as a trial in court. Next, let's talk about something even more horrifying: the fate of the Sicarii. These were a group of Jewish zealots who took part in the First Jewish-Roman War, and their punishment was as brutal as it was public. The Sicarii were known for their violent resistance against Roman rule, particularly for assassinating Roman soldiers and Jewish collaborators. But the Roman Empire, not one to take rebellion lightly, had a truly gruesome way of punishing these rebels. After the war, the survivors of the Sicarii were caught and subjected to damnatio ad bestias, which means being fed to the wild beasts, an execution so public and horrifying that it became a symbol of Roman power. Imagine this scene. The sun is setting over the Colosseum, and the air is thick with the scent of the crowd. You're one of the condemned, a member of the Sicarii who dared to fight back against Roman dominance. Now, you're being led into an arena, the roar of the crowd ringing in your ears. Before you can even react, massive, savage beasts, lions, tigers, or even bears, are set loose to tear you apart. This wasn't just an execution. It was a public spectacle, meant to remind the people that defying Rome wasn't just dangerous. It was utterly deadly. Historians still debate how widespread the practice of damnatio ad bestias was. Some suggest that it was mostly reserved for the most notorious criminals, particularly those who posed a serious threat to the empire. Others argue that it was used on a more regular basis, as a tool to quell any kind of rebellion or civil unrest. What's clear is that these executions were meant to instill fear in the hearts of the populace, showing them the fate of anyone who dared to challenge Roman authority. If you were caught up in the turmoil of rebellion, your death was not going to be a quiet, dignified affair. Instead, it would be a loud, violent reminder to the masses that Roman justice was final and often brutal. The Sicarii's gruesome fate highlights how Romans didn't just punish criminals. They made sure that their punishments were a public lesson. The condemned weren't executed behind closed doors. No, they were paraded in front of thousands of spectators who watched with morbid fascination as these prisoners were torn apart by beasts. The spectacle wasn't just about showing power. It was about making sure that the citizens of Rome understood the consequences of resistance. It was a twisted form of political theater, where bloodshed and brutality were the main acts. A quirky detail about these public executions. In some cases, the animals weren't even the worst part. The damnatio ad bestias could involve a whole series of tortures and humiliations before the beasts were released. The condemned would be tortured, starved, or physically weakened to make their suffering even more intense. It wasn't enough to just kill them. The Romans had a flair for the dramatic, making sure the condemned went through an agonizing display of vulnerability before meeting their end. For the Romans, these executions were a way to showcase their might, a message to everyone watching that to stand against the empire was not just to risk your life, but to risk a death filled with unimaginable horror. And in the case of the Sicarii, the whole thing was a grim reminder that the empire would stop at nothing to crush resistance. Now, let's take a look at one of the most excruciating forms of punishment the Romans reserved for their worst offenders: banishment to the mines. Imagine being condemned to spend the rest of your life working in a Roman mine, a place so brutal and unforgiving that survival itself felt like a miracle. The mines were where the empire extracted precious metals, iron, and other resources that fueled Rome's power and military expansion. But for criminals, especially slaves and soldiers who had committed offenses, being sent to the mines was the ultimate form of punishment. It wasn't just a prison sentence, it was a life sentence, a slow, torturous death in the bowels of the earth. If you were sent to the mines, you weren't heading to a cushy work camp or a controlled environment. No, you were sent to work in perilous conditions, with minimal food and no hope of escape. The mines were dark, cramped, and filled with toxic fumes, and the work was grueling. Prisoners had to mine in tunnels so narrow and deep that there was little chance of ever seeing daylight again. The Romans were known for their highly organized system of labor. But for those sent to the mines, it wasn't about productivity or organization. It was about making them disappear. Slowly. It was the punishment that broke both the body and the spirit. Historians still argue about the exact number of people sentenced to the mines. But one thing is certain. It was one of the most feared punishments in the Roman world. Some estimates suggest that thousands of slaves and criminals were sent to work in the mines, with many of them never emerging alive. If you were fortunate enough to survive the brutal conditions of the mines, you'd be lucky to live more than a few years. The harsh labor, the lack of food, and the constant threat of accidents made the mines a death sentence wrapped in slow agony. And if you were a slave, you were even more vulnerable, as your life was already considered expendable by Roman society. What makes banishment to the mines so fascinating is that it wasn't just about physical punishment. It was about stripping away everything that made someone human. You weren't just punished for your crime. You were erased from society, forgotten in the depths of the earth. There were no opportunities for redemption, no hope of rehabilitation. It was a form of punishment that served to remind the Romans that if you defied the empire, you'd be sent to an abyss where you could no longer be of use to anyone. A quirky little detail. In some cases, criminals weren't just thrown into the mines to do hard labor. They were sometimes sent to work on dangerous projects, like digging tunnels or constructing aqueducts, with little regard for their safety. These projects often required intense physical labor under harsh conditions, and the criminals assigned to them had little choice but to comply, even if they did manage to survive their time in the mines. They would emerge broken, if they emerged at all. In the end, banishment to the mines wasn't just about punishment. It was about sending a message. To be sent to the mines was to be condemned to live in a place where no one could see you, where you were removed from the world above and erased from history. It was a fate worse than death, and it highlighted just how far the Romans were willing to go to ensure that their laws and authority were respected. Now, let's explore a form of punishment that wasn't just brutal, but also strangely isolating. The punishment of banishment to the mines. You've heard of exile, right? Being sent away to some remote place to live out the rest of your days in isolation. Well, the Romans took that idea to an extreme. Instead of exile to some peaceful countryside, criminals, especially slaves, rebels, and those who had incurred the wrath of the state, were often sentenced to work in the Roman mines. This wasn't just being sent to a quiet corner of the empire to live out your days. No, it was a punishment that turned people into literal laborers, subjecting them to the most grueling, dangerous work imaginable. Imagine being dragged away from everything familiar, the city, your family, your home, and tossed into a world of darkness and back-breaking labor. The Roman mines were no ordinary mines. These were pits of hell, places where the air was thick with dust, where the walls of rock closed in on you, and where every day was a fight for survival. There was no luxury here, no reprieve. Prisoners were forced to mine precious metals, often with nothing more than rudimentary tools and minimal protection. Many would succumb to disease, exhaustion, or accidents in the mines. Even those who didn't die in the mines often returned as broken shells of the people they once were. Historians still argue about the scale and frequency of banishment to the mines. While it's clear that the Roman state used this form of punishment for criminals, slaves, and some of the worst offenders, there's debate over how common it really was. Some scholars suggest that it was a punishment primarily reserved for those who posed a direct threat to Roman society, rebels, or those who had committed serious crimes like murder or betrayal. Others believe that banishment to the mines was far more widespread, particularly for those who didn't have any social status or powerful family members to protect them. What's clear, though, is that being sent to the mines wasn't just about punishment. It was about sending a message. The Romans used forced labor to extract resources from their empire, but they also used it to break the will of those who had defied them. Working in the mines was a way to strip away any dignity or autonomy a person had left. The punishment was total, physical, psychological, and social. Even if you didn't die in the mines, you were still erased from society, forced to live in a dark, oppressive world with no future. A quirky tidbit about this punishment is that even soldiers weren't safe from it. Some Roman soldiers, who had been accused of cowardice or desertion, were also sent to the mines as punishment. The punishment was meant to break their spirit and eliminate any threat they might pose to the empire in the future. For the soldier who had once fought for Rome, this was a cruel irony, from battlefield hero to laborer in the dark, abandoned to a life of grueling, meaningless work. And the worst part, once you were in the mines, it was unlikely that anyone would even know what had happened to you. You'd just fade away, a forgotten soul working the earth until your last breath. Banishment to the mines wasn't a simple punishment. It was a complete erasure of one's identity, a removal from the world of society, and a sentence to a fate where death was often more desirable than living. And as harsh as this punishment was, it worked. The fear of being sent to the mines kept many in line, ensuring that those who even considered defying Rome thought twice before doing so. Next, let's talk about one of the most soul-crushing and relentless forms of punishment in ancient Rome: the treadmill of punishment. While this might not sound like the most terrifying punishment in the beginning, let me paint a picture for you. Imagine being sentenced to an endless, monotonous cycle of labor on a giant treadmill that never stops. Sounds like something out of a medieval torture chamber. Right, well, the Romans didn't shy away from creating grueling, relentless methods of punishment, and the treadmill was one of their more unique and physically exhausting ways to ensure prisoners suffered for their crimes. The treadmill in question wasn't like the kind you find in a modern gym. This was a massive contraption, often run by slaves or prisoners of war, that was designed to force the condemned to work tirelessly for hours, days, or even longer, in an effort to break their spirit. The treadmill itself consisted of a large wheel, often connected to a rotating shaft, powered by the prisoner's own feet as they trudged forward. If you stopped, the punishment didn't stop. You were kept in constant motion. The treadmill was often used in the mines or other harsh labor environments, where prisoners would work on these machines to pump water, grind grain, or even perform other physically exhausting tasks. Historians still debate how widely used this specific punishment was, and whether it was more of a practical tool for physical labor or a form of brutal punishment. Some argue that the treadmill was primarily used as a form of punishment for criminals or slaves who had already been convicted of serious crimes, while others believe that it was used as an everyday labor device for slaves in general, with its cruel punishment aspect reserved for those who misbehaved. What's certain is that the treadmill was a form of imprisonment that didn't rely on a cell or a cage. It relied on constant movement and physical endurance. The condemned weren't locked away in a cold cell. They were subjected to endless physical exertion that could wear down even the toughest individuals. A quirky detail here is that the treadmill wasn't just used in the mines or for hard labor. It was also occasionally used as a method of punishment for soldiers or other offenders. A soldier caught deserting or failing in their duties could find themselves put on the treadmill as punishment, forced to walk for hours on end, their feet aching, their minds slowly succumbing to the monotony of the task. It was a punishment that didn't just break the body, it broke the spirit, reminding the victim that escape was impossible and that their life was now bound to the relentless cycle of labor. For those sentenced to this kind of punishment, the treadmill wasn't just about physical pain, it was about erasing their autonomy. It was a constant reminder that they were nothing more than tools of the empire, their every step contributing to the empire's wealth and power. With no escape and no reprieve, in a world where status and family reputation meant everything, the treadmill turned even the most powerful or well-regarded individuals into mere cogs in the wheel of Roman society. The treadmill of punishment served as both a tool of labor and a method of breaking the will of the condemned. It wasn't just the suffering of physical exertion. It was the isolation, the psychological toll of knowing that you were stuck in a cycle that would never end. For those trapped in it, the punishment was not just a lesson in physical endurance, but in the complete loss of freedom. Let's move on to a punishment that involved an even more direct form of suffering: the excruciating scourging of Christians. In the early days of Roman rule, Christians were seen as a threat to the Roman state, mainly because they refused to worship the Roman gods and the emperor. Their resistance to Roman religious practices led to them being persecuted. And one of the more brutal forms of punishment inflicted upon them was scourging. This was a form of flagellation where a person was whipped with a flagrum, a multi-thonged whip, sometimes embedded with pieces of metal or bone to tear at the flesh. Imagine this. You're a Christian in the Roman Empire, and you've been caught practicing your faith openly. Your punishment is scourging. You are tied up, your hands bound to a pillar or post, and then you are lashed with the flagrum. Each strike is meant to break the skin, to tear at your muscles and flesh, often causing deep lacerations. The punishment wasn't just physical. It was also deeply humiliating. It was a public display, designed to show others the consequences of defying Roman law and the Roman gods. Historians still debate the extent to which Christians were regularly scourged. Some argue that it was a widespread practice, especially during periods of intense persecution, while others suggest that it was just one of several forms of punishment used against early Christians. One thing is certain: scourging was a punishment designed to instill both physical and psychological suffering. Not only did it leave the victim physically maimed, but it also shattered the person's dignity and identity. For the Christians, this form of punishment was part of the larger strategy of Roman religious control, breaking the spirit of those who refused to worship the state-sanctioned gods and ensuring that their beliefs were suppressed. The scourging wasn't a quick death, though it was a prolonged agony that could last for hours, depending on the number of lashes inflicted. Some victims would survive it, though many would die from the wounds or the infection that followed. The wounds themselves were often so severe that the victim could be left in a state of shock, unable to move or even speak. A quirky tidbit here is that some early Christian writings describe the scourging of their fellow believers with a certain reverence, almost a sense of martyrdom. Being scourged was seen as a way of sharing in the suffering of Christ, and many Christians accepted their punishment as a necessary act to show their faith. In fact, some even considered it a form of honor. But for the majority, it was a horrific experience, a physical and emotional ordeal that would leave permanent scars. While the Romans were not the only ones to use flogging and scourging as punishment, the Roman method was particularly brutal, and it was reserved for those who defied the empire's religious and moral order. The scourging of Christians was not only about physical pain, it was about social control, about ensuring that any challenge to Roman authority was met with harsh punishment, often intended to break the spirit of the accused and prevent the spread of dissent. Now, let's dive into something particularly gruesome: damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts. This was one of the most public and horrific forms of Roman punishment, and it was designed not only to kill, but to do so in a way that would leave a lasting mark on the collective memory of Rome. Criminals, slaves, prisoners of war, and those who defied Roman authority could be condemned to a gruesome death in the arena, where they would be torn apart by wild animals, lions, tigers, bears, or even crocodiles, while the crowds cheered. Imagine being led into a massive arena, your hands bound, knowing that you're about to face the jaws of a hungry beast. The crowd is watching you, eagerly anticipating the bloodshed, and the air is thick with anticipation. You're thrown into the arena, and the wild animal is released. There is no way out. It is a terrifying, humiliating end, designed not just to kill you, but to turn your death into a public spectacle that would serve as a warning to anyone who might consider defying the Roman state. Damnatio ad bestias was often reserved for those who had committed particularly heinous crimes, like treason, or for people who were seen as enemies of the state, like rebellious slaves or prisoners of war. It was a punishment that didn't just deal out death. It turned the victim's last moments into entertainment for the masses. The more vicious the animal, the more spectacular the punishment. It was a bloody spectacle meant to reinforce the power of the state, while showing everyone the fate of those who would challenge it. Historians still argue about how often damnatio ad bestias was used. Some suggest that it was relatively rare, reserved for only the most serious offenders, while others believe it was a more common form of public punishment, especially in the later years of the Roman Empire. It's clear, however, that the spectacle had an immense psychological impact, both on those who were sentenced to it and on the public watching from the stands. It was one of the most extreme ways the Romans showcased their might and their ability to control life and death. The brutal public executions not only served as a form of justice, but as a tool to keep the population in line. A quirky detail about damnatio ad bestias is that some prisoners were actually trained to fight the beasts. These gladiators were often prisoners or criminals who were given the chance to fight wild animals in the arena, either as a form of redemption or simply as a final form of punishment. This was different from the gladiator fights you might be familiar with, where combatants were trained to fight each other. In damnatio ad bestias, the criminals weren't fighting other humans. They were fighting for their lives, against creatures who were faster, stronger, and more dangerous than any man. What's particularly striking about this form of punishment is its public nature. The Romans were masters at turning execution into a spectacle, and damnatio ad bestias was no exception. People didn't just die in silence. They were made an example of in front of thousands, their suffering a form of entertainment for the masses. This punishment wasn't only about removing the criminal, It was about keeping the Roman people in check, showing them the brutal consequences of defying the state and reminding them of the empire's absolute power. Now, let's shift gears a bit and dive into the mythological realm of punishment, because the Romans loved a good myth to explain their justice. One of the most famous mythological punishments that resonates with their real-world practices is Prometheus and his punishment, which mirrored some of the most extreme penalties in Roman society. According to Greek mythology, Prometheus, the Titan who gave fire to mankind, was punished by the gods for his transgression. The punishment, he was bound to a rock, and every day an eagle would come and eat his liver, only for it to regenerate each night, a seemingly endless cycle of torment and suffering. While this was a punishment given by the gods, it symbolized the kind of extreme and relentless justice that the Romans also loved to impose on their own criminals. This myth of eternal torment seems to resonate with how the Romans sometimes approach punishment. If you were accused of a particularly heinous crime, you might find yourself facing a kind of punishment that didn't just end with death. It stretched out over time, leaving you to suffer in unimaginable ways. Much like Prometheus, the Romans had their own form of eternal suffering, even if it wasn't quite as dramatic as the myth. Those condemned to hard labor in the mines, or those suffering from extreme forms of punishment, like crucifixion or being fed to wild animals, often faced conditions that seemed as torturous as Prometheus's eternal torment. Historians still argue whether the myth of Prometheus's punishment was used by the Romans as a cautionary tale. Some suggest that the story was intended to symbolize the consequences of defying divine authority, an idea that likely resonated with the Roman approach to justice. In the Roman world, defying the state or the emperor was viewed as a grave sin, one that deserved not just death, but prolonged suffering. For the Romans, punishment was a tool of deterrence and social control. And much like the gods' eternal punishment of Prometheus, Roman punishments were meant to be enduring and symbolic, serving as constant reminders of the power and the cost of defying authority. A quirky tidbit. Interestingly, the story of Prometheus's punishment wasn't just a tale of divine retribution. It was also one of hope and eventual redemption. According to myth, Prometheus's suffering was finally brought to an end when the hero Hercules, came to his aid and killed the eagle. In a way, this mirrored the Roman belief in the possibility of redemption through a heroic act. Some prisoners who faced extreme punishments might have been granted the chance to earn their freedom if they survived long enough or proved their worth through service. While it didn't happen often, it was a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise brutal system. For the Romans, however, the idea of eternal suffering wasn't just confined to mythology. They were fond of making the lives of their prisoners or traitors long and agonizing, ensuring that punishment didn't just end with death. Just like Prometheus, some victims faced a slow, prolonged form of suffering, whether in the mines, in chains, or as a spectacle for the amusement of the crowds. In the end, the punishment wasn't just about the body. It was about breaking the spirit, about forcing the condemned to live out their days in torment. Let's now move on to another form of punishment in ancient Rome that often flew under the radar, but was still intensely brutal: the trial for sacrilege. Now, you might think of sacrilege as simply disrespecting sacred objects or places. But in Roman society, it was far more than that. It was considered a direct assault on the divine power that the Romans believed protected their empire. To violate a sacred space or object wasn't just a minor offense. It was an act of defiance against the gods themselves. And the consequences for such crimes were severe. Imagine being accused of defiling a temple, stealing from a sacred altar, or committing an act of sacrilege during a religious ceremony. To the Romans, this was a crime that could bring about not only personal punishment, but the wrath of the gods themselves, and perhaps even bring bad fortune to the entire empire. Sacrilege was treated as a form of treason, and punishments for it were meant to demonstrate the absolute power of Roman religion. The penalty for sacrilege wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was often execution, with some criminals being subjected to gruesome methods of death, such as burning, being thrown to wild animals, or even crucifixion. Historians still debate the exact punishments used for sacrilege, as the records are often sparse and the practice varied over time. In some cases, the punishment was more public and symbolic. Public flogging, the mutilation of the body, or the desecration of the criminal's own tomb were used as ways to both punish and serve as a warning to others. However, in more severe cases, the punishment was death, and the methods were as brutal as any the Romans used for other crimes. In this case, the act of offending the divine was seen as a greater crime than any mortal sin, and the punishment reflected that. The Romans' intense fear and reverence for their gods meant that offenses against the gods were considered to threaten the very stability of the empire. This made sacrilege not just a personal sin, but a crime against the Roman state. Some forms of punishment for sacrilege involved making the criminal an example for the masses, tortured in front of the public, and their fate used as a reminder of the divine justice that reigned over the empire. Much like other public executions, this act of justice was more about the message it sent to the people than the actual punishment itself. A quirky tidbit about sacrilege punishments. In some cases, the Romans would even punish the entire family or household of the person who committed sacrilege. It wasn't just the individual who would pay. Their entire family could suffer the consequences. This collective form of punishment further reinforced the idea that one person's crime was a reflection of the moral failure of the entire family, and by extension, their community. The punishment for sacrilege could be so severe that it would result in the complete ruin of an entire household or even a neighborhood, reminding everyone that the Romans took their religious obligations seriously, and any violation would be punished not just for its individual effects, but be it for its potential to disrupt the social order. The Romans used these intense methods of punishment for sacrilege not only to deal with perceived threats to their religion, but also to preserve the public order and the political power of the empire. Through these brutal acts, they ensured that their control over both the state and the divine was unchallenged, making sure that any act of rebellion against the gods, or by extension, the empire, was met with swift and severe consequences. As we come to the final part of our journey through the most bizarre punishments of ancient Rome, let's step back and reflect on the long-lasting legacy of these harsh methods of justice. Despite the extreme nature of Roman punishments, many of them had a profound impact on how law and justice evolved in later civilizations, including in the development of modern legal systems. Some of the punishments were designed to serve as deterrents, while others, like crucifixion or damnatio ad bestias, were meant to maintain order through fear and terror. While the Romans were known for their cruelty and theatrical public executions, they also believed in the importance of public displays of power. They understood that justice wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about reinforcing the idea that the state had the ultimate power over life and death, and that those who defied it would face consequences that were not just personal, but symbolic. Public executions, like gladiatorial combat and damnatio ad bestias, were spectacles, and they were designed to send a message to the masses. Challenge Rome, and you will pay the price in ways that will be remembered by all. Roman punishment methods, though extreme, served as a tool to keep the empire's vast population under control. It wasn't just about punishing individuals, it was about reinforcing the power and authority of the Roman state, ensuring that everyone knew their place in society, and that defying the state could result in unimaginable suffering. Some forms of punishment, like poena culae or the trial by hot iron, were bizarre and cruel in ways that still shock us today. But they reflected a society that had no qualms about using physical and psychological suffering to enforce its laws. In some ways, we can see echoes of these ancient methods in our modern criminal justice systems. While we've certainly moved away from crucifixions and punishments involving wild animals, there are still traces of the public display of justice. In some societies, executions are still carried out publicly, often with the intention of sending a message about the power of the state. And even in modern legal systems, the need to deter crime is still a driving force behind many laws and punishments. But in the end, what's truly fascinating about Roman punishment isn't just how brutal it was. It's how it reflects the values of the society that created it. The Romans believed in the power of the state to shape the lives of its citizens, to control their behavior, and to instill fear when necessary. Their punishments were often designed not just to eliminate criminals, but to send a message to everyone else. In that sense, Roman punishment wasn't just about justice. It was about control, order, and maintaining the power of the empire. So, as we wrap up tonight's exploration of ancient Roman punishments, remember that while we may have moved far away from some of these extreme methods, the power of punishment to shape society and deter crime is still an important part of our modern systems of law. And, when it comes to the legacies of history, it's always a bit unsettling to realize how some things never really change. Now, let your mind drift, knowing that you're safely tucked away in your modern world, far removed from the brutal extremes of ancient justice. Let the peaceful sounds of the night take over, and feel comforted knowing that the horrors of the past can only be learned from, never relived.